Hello, welcome to Learn Anatomy with Dr. Veso. Today we'll be looking at part 3 of ossification of upper limb bones. In part 1, we looked at definition of ossification, types of ossification, and ossification centers. In part 2, we look at the general rules of ossification and ossification of the clavicle. Now in part 3, we'll be looking at ossification of some individual bones of the upper limb. We have treated the ossification of the clavicle in part 1, and today we'll be looking at some of the upper limb bone, and we'll be starting with the scapula. The first thing that is written here is that the scapula undergoes endochondral ossification, and you must take note of this. Now it has one primary center that appears now it has one primary center that appears at around the 8 weeks of interuterine life. That's where the primary center appears, and it has 7 secondary centers that appear in different timeline. Now I want you to notice something, that the total number of centers that the scapula has is what? 1 plus 7, which is 8 centers. 8 centers. And these 8 centers can also help you to know that the primary centers are the primary center. These 8 centers can also help you to know that the primary center appears at the 8th weeks of interuterine life. So you must take note of this. Okay, the primary center is just one, so it will be found at the diaphysis of the bone. Now remember, when I was discussing about the secondary center, I told you that the first 2 letters of the secondary center can help us remember that the secondary center forms the epiphysis, and the epiphysis is usually at the ends of bone. And in one of our videos, we use the mnemonic ends to remember that epiphysis, the E here, will help us know that the epiphysis is at the ends of bone. While the diaphysis, the D and S here, helps us remember that the diaphysis forms the chaff. So it's at the chaff of the bone, not the ends of bone. So if you have this in mind, you can now say the secondary center should be located at the ends of the scapula. So if you look at the end of the scapula, and the ends of the scapula are this and this. These are the ends of the scapula. So you can also think of up to the shoulder joint, down to the spine. Up to the shoulder joint will help you know that it is the coracoid, the acromion, and the glenoid that form the secondary center for the scapula here. Now the coracoid has 2 secondary center, the acromion have 2 secondary center, while the glenoid cavity have 1 secondary center up to the shoulder joint. And these parts I just circled are the part that form articulation with the humerus to form the shoulder joint. That's why I said up to the shoulder joint. So the end that is up to the shoulder joint form secondary ossification for scapula, while the end that is down to the spine, what is down to the spine? We have the inferior angle. And what is this? This is the what? Medial border. So the inferior angle of the scapula and the medial border of the scapula also has an ossification center. It has a secondary ossification center. So we just up to the shoulder joint, down to the spine. You can remember the secondary ossification center of the scapula. You should always bear this in mind, that the secondary ossification center should be found at the ends of the bone, because the secondary ossification center forms the epiphysis, and the epiphysis represents the ends of the bone. I will keep emphasizing this so that you will get this and you will always remember it. Now the next bone we'll be looking at is the humerus. The humerus is the next bone we're looking at. From what I've written here, the humerus has 1 primary center and 7 secondary centers. The primary center appears at the 8 weeks of intrauterine life. You can still use that same thing I told you. The humerus have a total number of 8 centers. And this total number of 8 centers can help you remember that the humerus primary center appears at the 8 weeks of life. Now, the secondary centers can be located at the upper end, as I told you, and the lower end. The upper end and the lower end, because the secondary center form the epiphysis, and the epiphysis are the end of the bone. Now, at the upper end, it is seen in the head. It is seen in the head of the humerus. It is seen in the lesser tubercle, and it is seen in the greater tubercle at the upper end. The head, the lesser tubercle, and the greater tubercle. You can remember this way: greater and lesser head, greater and lesser head. So it is seen in the greater tubercle, lesser tubercle, and it is seen in the head of the humerus. Now, remember one of the rules of ossification is that the growing end appears earlier and fuse later. The growing end of the humerus is the upper end of the humerus. Now, if you watch my video on growing end, which I discussed, you will notice that I told you that the growing end of the upper limb moves away from the elbow joint. The growing end of the upper limb moves away from the elbow joint. As I said, the growing end of the upper limb bone moves away from the elbow joint. So, for example, if this is the elbow joint, this is the radius, this is the humerus, this is the radius, this is the ulna, and this is the elbow joint. The growing end moves away from the elbow joint. Therefore, the humerus, the growing end of the humerus will be at the proximal part of the humerus, while the growing end of the ulna and radius will be at the distal. Therefore, the upper end of the humerus is the growing end of the humerus, and that's why it appears earlier. The head appears at 1 year. The lesser tubercle appears at 3 years. The greater tubercle appears at 5 years. Now, for the lower end, we have capitulum, which appears at 1 to 2 years. Medial epicondyl, which appears at 5 to 8 years. Trachea, which appears at 9 to 10 years. Lateral epicondyle, which appears at 16 to 18 years. Now, you can use this mnemonic to remember the lower end of the humerus. Clever men teach leaders. Clever. C, the letter C in clever helps us remember capitulum. The letter M in men helps us remember medial epicondyle. The letter T in teach helps us remember trachea. The letter L in leaders help us to remember lateral epicondyle. And this is how they appear, because they can ask in MCQ which of the lower end of the secondary ossification center of the humerus appears first. Now, the next bone we'll be looking at is the radius, and we'll say that the radius has 1 primary center and 2 secondary centers. Now, the primary center as other long bone appears at 8 weeks. Remember, the humerus appears at 8 weeks. The clavicle appears at 5 to 6 weeks because it appears earlier. The scapula appears at 8 weeks. Now, for the humerus, the same thing appears at 8 weeks. Now, it has 2 secondary ossification center. Remember what I told you, that the growing end of the growing end appears first, then fuse later. And the growing end for the radius is what? The distal end of radius. And it appears first, which is 1 to 2 years. it appears first. Now the proximal end is the non-growing end of the radius, which appears later. For the ulna, it has two. For the ulnar bone, it has one primary center which appears at 8 weeks of intrauterine life, and two secondary centers which appears at 5 to 6 years of life and 8 to 11 years of life. The distal end of the ulna is the growing end of the ulna, so it appears earlier, which will be in our row for ossification, while the proximal end of the ulna is the non-growing end of the ulna, which appears later. We have come to the end of part 3 of ossification of long bone, where we looked at ossification of the scapula, the humerus, the ulna, and the radius. In the next part, I'll be looking at ossification of the remaining upper limb bones. Thank you for watching.